Hi, guys. Welcome to Real Food Recovery. We are very excited today. We have a very special guest, and I can't wait to say hello to Jamie and have her introduce him. So, without further ado, let's just get right into it. Hey, Jamie, how's it going?
Hi, Paige. Good to see you. Glad to be here always. Glad to be here for with Real Food Recovery. And so glad to be here with our special guest. We have the very, very esteemed Dr. Judd Brewer with us today. And we'll talk about who Dr. Brewer is in a moment. But I just want to say that Dr. Brewer, despite his astounding catalog of work and research and books and interviews and his thought leadership in the space around anxiety, habit formation, habit change, Dr. Brewer is just so kind, down to earth, and approachable. And I am truly, truly looking forward to this conversation. Dr. Brewer's work has had such an impact on my own recovery from more years of morbid obesity and the processed food addiction that Paige and I sort of talk about all the time. So I just have a deep, deep sense of gratitude for you, Dr. Brewer, and I'm so grateful that you gave Paige and I, in our fledgling year of our podcast, gave us a nod and gave us your time. So thank you.
Oh, my pleasure.
So Dr. Judson Brewer is an MD and PhD. He's an internationally renowned addiction psychiatrist and neuroscientist. He's a professor in the School of Public Health and Medical School at Brown University. His 2016 TED Talk, A Simple Way to Break a Bad Habit, has been viewed more than 19 million times. He has trained Olympic athletes and coaches, government ministers, and business leaders. His first book, The Craving Mind, was published in more than 16 languages. His second book, Unwinding Anxiety, was an instant New York Times bestseller, and his latest release, The Hunger Habit, will be the topic of our conversation today. So I am, again, truly excited to talk to you, Dr. Brewer, especially because Paige and I come to our podcast and Real Food Recovery, the company we're building, the community we're building. We come to it from a place of processed food obsession, processed food abuse, addictions around, the for so many years of our lives. We're talking decades, each of us decades. We dealt with this sort of addiction to food and the habits around it. The process looked very different for Paige and I. If it's a spectrum of using food in habitual ways or in obsessive ways, we were on two different sides of that spectrum. I was on one side with morbid obesity and years of progressive health issues related to that. Paige's side was much different. Paige's side was sort of walking around in a very, very normal looking life, a very, very acceptable, normal looking, socially acceptable body. And she was, like me, completely obsessed with processed foods, with the behaviors around processed foods, and with finding out, how to sort of get that next fix, which was both of us were really caught in the same prison. So we have a very shared experience, but we come to it from very different places. And what we found in recovery, in our recovery podcast and our recovery community, is how important it is to look at the foundation of habits that led us to the addictive foods, and habits that can take us out of the addictive foods. And I just want to start from a place of this wonderful quote in your book from James Joyce and his opening line in one of his works about Mr. Duffy lived a short distance from his body. That absolutely was me. Almost all of my addictive years, up until I was in my mid-30s, I lived a short distance from my body, and I truly did not have the understanding and connection of mind and body. So when I read your book and I listened to your interviews, I just can't believe how much I identify with the folks that you interviewed for this book. Can you talk about the disconnection of mind and body, how it leads to folks developing habits around anything, in particular food?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. So, what I've seen in my clinic, and we've also seen this in the research studies that my lab has done, is that there's often some way that somebody learns that distancing, it's either the cause of, somebody forming some eating habits, or, can be an effect of somebody developing an eating habit.
Mhm.
And just think, I could think of, I'm sorting through my brain of many of my patients who would be good examples of this. But just as an example, I have a patient, I actually write about him in the Hunger Habit, who first came to see me in my clinic because of anxiety. He was 400 pounds when he came to see me. And what he talked about was, when he was early in life, he just started getting really severe panic attacks, and he would start eating as a way to numb himself. And fast forward, 20, 30 years, he couldn't have mirrors in his apartment because he was so self-judgmental about his appearance.
Mhm.
So it was, you can see this as, as a fifth grader, as a 10-year-old starting to develop these eating habits. He would eat as a way to numb himself, and kind of that was one of the few things that helped him temporarily with his anxiety. And that was, that set up this process of distancing himself from his body, not only because the anxiety was very uncomfortable, but then over the years developing this loathing of what his body looked like, if I can use those terms.
Absolutely.
And that then just compounding and, literally feeding the whole situation for him for literally for 30 years.
Yeah, I could definitely relate. I
Do
could definitely
you
relate.
So we're talking really about food addiction. That's what our whole Real Food Recovery is set up on. We're an online food addiction recovery community that meets several times a day and helps people that are in this food obsessive state. So I'm curious to know if you consider food addiction an actual diagnosis. If it's not, what needs to happen in order to get it in the DSM-5? And the tail end of that question is, do you think obesity could ever be obtained without the use of processed foods
Mhm.
in that?
So- Yeah. So let's start with the first question. One, as a board certified card carrying psychiatrist, I've not been the biggest fan of the DSM, and some of it as a scientist, it was set up as a billing document for people back in the day, and kind of got this legacy, of debt, in the sense of, like, it has all this history that makes it challenging to change. And so it was never set up as a scientific or real diagnostic uh, process itself. And then it's really struggled to move on from that. So, we can say, well, it'd be great to get stuff in the DSM-5. I would say it'd be great to move on from the DSM-5 and really find things that line up with biology, line up with individual variability, and most importantly, line up with science. So with that, with that as a preface, let's place the DSM off to the side and say, answer the question directly around food addiction. There's been a lot of debate about this.
Yeah.
Academics love to
Right.
debate things.
Right,
So
right. That's our big point. They spend a
yeah.
lot of time debating. Let's just talk
Mhm.
about the solution. But anyway,
Yeah.
interrupting.
Yeah.
Good point.
So, I'm not sure. I don't have an answer to the debate because people are going to debate forever. But like you're highlighting, debates don't actually often translate into pragmatic change for people. So, as a clinician, I would say, something that has been helpful for me, both as a scientist and a clinician, is the simple definition of addiction that I learned in residency, which is continued use despite adverse consequences.
Mhm.
And so I have plenty of patients that could say, they're eating when they're not hungry, continued use despite adverse consequences. And we can look at both mental and physical adverse consequences that they're having. So, for example, my patient Rob he had steatohepatitis. He had a fatty liver, basically. He had hypertension. He had obstructive sleep apnea, and all of those were a direct result of his weight. So, and this can actually help us get into your second question. So for him, his 400 pounds was very unhealthy for him. So we could say, And then, he talked about how he was literally addicted to junk food, or to fast food in particular. And he described how he would do the same behaviors that his friends that were addicted to other substances would do, where he would hide his behavior. He would, eat quickly. He'd go to a drive-through, get a bunch of food, eat quickly, throw it all out so nobody knew. All these things that you can see have direct parallels to other substances. So for him, that if you had just substituted some other substance that is less controversial as an addiction, whether it's cocaine or heroin or meth or whatever, say, well, adverse consequences. And so to me, whatever the behavior is, let's not get stuck in the debates of whether something is this or that. Let's focus on the real humans that are affected by them. He was directly affected by this big time, right? So that was just his physical health. His mental health, oh, he had anxiety, and he had health anxiety on top of his anxiety, because he was looking at all these health consequences that he was suffering from. So he had both physical and mental health consequences based on, on his eating patterns. So did that get at that first part of the question?
Yeah, yeah. And that's why I wanted to segue into, had he not had, whether we call it food addiction or not, had he not had the exposure, I'm guessing he got to where he was only through the processed foods. And maybe the more correct question I should have asked is, food addiction, does it have to be parallel with processed foods? Otherwise, could you have food addiction without processed foods? Would you ever be obese without processed foods? Does that make sense?
It does. It's a good question. And I think, the scientific and medical community is rightfully rethinking the term obesity itself. And so, I'm sure you've talked about this before. So from a clinical, we could think of this as like clinical obesity, meaning does something lead to health problems for somebody, versus somebody being at a heavier weight than what is societally, quote unquote, acceptable right now. And, I hope that, well, we are changing those norms. It's very, very slowly. So I think those are different things, where somebody can be fat, quote unquote, and they can be societally shaming or shamed by society based on the thinness that society, it tells us that we should expect, versus they could be healthy fat. Let's call it that. Whereas fatness was actually a sign of opulence back in the day, because people could afford to eat enough food that would help them survive a famine. And so, in fact, that's what our bodies are set up for, is to survive famines. And so you can, the paradox is now that's shamed, because somebody decided that a certain waist size or body size was not just acceptable, but desirable. And that's just a habit, a societal habit.
Yeah.
Very true. Very true. One of the, and I can absolutely, the what you shared about this patient of yours, and the way that he would use food, the way that he would use fast food, and have that experience of, binging and hiding it, and, acting like it didn't happen. And absolutely my experience as well around anxiety, depression, and then health anxiety on top of it. I think that's so interesting, because one of the areas that you talk about in getting folks from that place of mindlessness, leading the mindlessness that can lead to depression and anxiety, and addictive behaviors. How does one go from that place of mindlessness and all of the cascade of things that comes with it, to a place of mindfulness around the very thing that causes them so much pain? Like,
yeah, it's a great question. And I think that, you'd also ask the question around, this ultra processed foods and how that plays a role. I think that's related to this question as well. So let's kind of lead in through that door. If you look at, it's a really good question. Could someone be addicted to food in the absence of, engineering and ultra processed, food? I don't know the answer to that, because, as a scientist, I would want to see data to see if that's possible. What I think we could I would hypothesize, and if I were a betting person, this is what I would bet on, is that it's at least much harder to do.
Mhm.
And the reason for that is with whole foods, the our bodies kind of let's say co-evolved, or if somebody prefers non-evolutionary terms, co-designed with food. So as humans, the fiber amount, the fact that you can't just access sugar very easily in whole foods is there for a reason. And our bodies say, hey, I need this amount of nutrients and I'm going to get it. And then it registers fullness, whether we eat fruit or, vegetables or whatever. And so it's really hard, it's just really hard to get the amount of calories in with
Right.
whole food as compared to like low fat foods that are designed to bypass the satiety cues,
Mm-hmm.
as composed to the compared to the vanishing caloric density, which by design is there to get our body tricked into
Right.
thinking, did I just eat something? No, I must not have. So let me eat another,
Mhm.
to all the things that get us, addicted to food. Like back, it was 1963 that Lay's came up with the "Bet you can't just eat one" slogan, right? So,
They were
the,
right.
yeah, well, and they were designing it that way. Or
Absolutely.
you know,
Absolutely.
my favorite headline from The Onion, Doritos celebrates its 1 millionth ingredient. You know, all of those point to all of the person years that were put into designing these things to be ultra addictive.
Yeah, totally.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well,
So I don't, again, we could go back and look at before the food industry really took off, before, I would say, before the 1950s,
mhm.
and check to see, but, and it's hard to separate all the historical things, but we certainly have not, they weren't talking about an obesity epidemic before
Right.
1950.
No,
Mm.
very true. Very, very true.
So I have a story to tell you. You're part of the story. This happened 2 days ago. We have 5-year-old twin granddaughters, and we had to take them to a birthday party. Their parents were working or something, and so we needed to take them, which is fine. I know it's a 2-hour extravaganza of, what it's like at a 5-year-old birthday party, right? It's the jumpy jump
Yeah.
house and the cake and every type of potato chip and Hawaiian punch imaginable. So I braced myself. I took my book with me. I was involved with your book. I could let them do the bouncy houses while I distract myself. I had thought through the occasion and how I was going to handle it. I do not go unprepared. I do think these things through before I'm in that high exposure arena. Got through it fine, even though there's the cake all over me and I'm wiping up sticky and all that. And they each wanted to take home one of their open little single size potato chip bags. And I'm like, yeah, that's fine. So I'm taking, I got to carry it in the car and we get home. Well, their parents aren't quite home. So we have to go in. And by that time, 20 minutes has gone by and I'm ready to get home. So I'm getting a little anxious. And I'm like, you guys, you're done with these chips, right? I just wanted to get them out of my sight. So I go to throw them in the trash. Threw the one in the trash. The next, there was 2 potato chips left in the bottom of the bag, and I don't know what happened. The demons came out of nowhere. I reached in, ate the potato chips, threw the bag away. So here's my question. What do you call that? Cueing? Do you call it triggering? Do you call it lack of willpower? Do you call it a habit problem? Why did I do that, Dr. Brewer?
Yeah. So it's a good thing you're sitting on a couch so we can analyze this, right?
If you want me to lay down, I can lay down.
So walk me through, were you aware when your hand was in the bag and the chips were coming out?
I'm telling you, it was an out of body
Yeah.
experience. It happened and it was in my gullet before I'm like, what the hell did you do that for? Why did I do that?
Yeah.
And I had already messaged our recovery group to say, hey man, I made it through the birthday
Yeah.
party. I'm
Yeah. Yeah.
safe. I'm feeling good. Brag, 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 brag.
Yeah.
And it bit me. And then
Yeah.
it opened up the floodgates for the rest of the evening of eating not in a way that I'm used to eating. It was a bizarre out of body
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah.
So aware,
Well,
no, no.
yeah. Yeah. I'm not saying it was aliens, but it was aliens. And by that I'm jokingly saying that that's where when these habit let's say circuits or processes get kicked off, it can
Yes.
feel like an out of body, almost alien
Yes.
like experience.
Well,
Yes.
what was the habit? What was the habit cycle that got kicked off? Because it's not like she had a habit of cleaning up and throwing away food, or is that what it was?
Well, so it can simply be triggered by a certain type of food. So my guess is that's not the first time you've ever eaten potato chips. Is that true?
Yes, that was the very first time. We can edit that out.
No, no. Let's keep going. But the reason I asked that question is that you at some point you develop some relationship to potato chips.
Mhm.
Is that fair to say?
Yes.
And what was that relationship like back in the day?
Well, so it was always around an event or excitement. I mean,
Uh-huh.
potato chip excitement, potato chip fun,
Hmm.
potato chip bet you can't just eat one. I had two. I
Yeah.
mean, and if there had been more in the bag, that was a fire hose of, woo, okay, what else can I get?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So
So the way that, and we can walk through some of the science about how this works. I think this will be a great example of this, where, we, so you're highlighting how our brain's wires they get crossed
that's
basically.
exactly it.
Yeah. So at some point, it sounds like you learned to eat in the absence of hunger because these potato chips are designed to get you to do that.
Mhm.
And you said, oh, you can associate potato chips with fun or woo or party. It's like
Mhm.
that's the fun part where your brain says, hey, potato chips fun house. And so that can go back for anybody. It can go back to, I mean, the birthday party is a great example. That's often where kids learn to associate
Totally.
potato chips and cake and ice cream with celebrations. And so our brains are set up to learn to eat food when we're hungry. It's called homeostatic hunger. And in modern day, because of all this food engineering and whatnot, we get driven to eat in the absence of hunger to the point where it's so common. Scientists had to come up with a misnomer term, which is called hedonic hunger, right?
Mhm.
It's a misnomer because we're not eating when we're hungry, but it's highlighting how we're eating because of mood. It's that food mood relationship that gets set up. And that's not a pro survival strategy. It actually causes all sorts of health problems for a lot of people. So for you, it sounds like the potato chips got set up as woo,
Mhm.
and that woohoo, when it becomes a habit by definition is something that we do automatically. And so that, the way you described it is the alien possession, right? Not
You
my
all know
hand that reached
what
in
I'm
the
talking
bag.
about, right?
Yeah, yeah. So you eat these. It's like, oh, see the potato chip, and the circuit gets kicked off that says eat the potato chip, right? And what that can do on top of it is to say, my patients call this the effits, right? Where the scientific term is called the abstinence violation effect, where if we've lived for a long time with these, food rules, for example, where it's like I can't eat potato chips or whatever, as
Mhm.
soon as something clicks that off and says, hey, you've already done it, F it, just go for it, right? All bets are off.
Totally. I got
Yeah.
a case
Yeah.
of that. Hmm.
Yeah. So the efforts kick in because the brain's like, thank God, finally I'm out of food jail. And this
Yes.
feels so good to be free. I'm just gonna go nuts.
Hmm. Hmm.
So which also highlights one of the downsides to one of the many downsides of the food rules thing, that's based on willpower.
Got it.
So, am I capturing what your experience was the other day?
Yeah. Yeah. Total big capital F of the F-its. And well, I've had the two potato chips. Well, the other grandson's eating, a cracker or something like that. I'll have a taste of his and might as well go ahead and get it out of the way now before I get home and have to face reality again if this is not who I am and what I do. It's like two different people that live inside my
But
body.
I did hear you say, and could this be related? I heard you say before you talked about throwing the bags away that you were feeling anxious.
I
because
was.
you were wanting to get
I
home
was,
and get
yeah.
back to your routine and
Mhm.
thinking of all the things you had to
Yes.
do. How does the anxiety that one feels
Yeah.
relate to the habit, or is that anxiety part of the habit?
Yeah. Well, nice pickup on that because that highlights one of these food mood relationships. And this, from the standpoint of how our brains learn, this is called negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement basically is set up where something unpleasant triggers us to do a behavior to make that unpleasant thing go away. And so in the past, if you'd learned to eat because you're anxious, that's why the term stress eating came about. It's not because that's hedonic hunger right there. We're not eating because we're hungry, we're eating because we're stressed. And then the potato chips numb us. A lot of my patients talk about food numbing them. So they use that as their number. So, nummy, 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 because it numbs me, so to speak.
Oh, that's a good one. I've never
Yeah,
heard that.
I mean, either that just happened.
Bravo. Bravo.
So we eat to numb ourselves, and that gets negatively reinforced, and then that gets locked away as a habit, and which can just come out of nowhere, where it feels like alien possession because it just, wow, where'd that come from? Must have been an
Yes.
alien because that's not me.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's negative reinforcement in a nutshell, or in a potato chip bag in this case.
And what does the phrase connect to? And that's not me. Like, what is that? How does that literally connect to that? Does it connect to the disconnection?
Yeah, it's a great question. So if we form a persona or some idealized self, I'm somebody that it has good self-example. That, just using that as an example, there can be many different ideas that we have about ourselves or stories that we want to personify. We can say, "Oh, I'm not that person. That was an alien that possessed me," right? Because I want to be this idealized non-potato chip eating person that has a lot of self-control.
Mhm.
Got it. How do stories? So we spend a lot of time in the problem, and Paige and I love to spend time in the solution. How do the stories we tell ourselves, or do the stories we tell ourselves, good or bad, do they play into the solution, aka mindfulness, presence?
Yes, I don't think the stories are strong enough to play into solid solutions. And I think you're highlighting it, Paige, here, where it's like, I'm not somebody that eats potato chips, but I just ate potato chips.
Mhm. And
Right.
can I say I was making fun of my husband earlier?
And I'll just
Eating them
add,
at the party.
and they set us up to beat ourselves up. Oh,
Yeah, very
say
true.
that again.
I was making fun of my husband earlier because he was eating them, and internally I was going, ugh, I roll. I mean, look at him, how weak he is. He's eating those disgusting potato chips. I am
Yeah.
so much better than that.
Yeah. Yeah. So
He
you
should
set
be.
yourself up on that pedestal to then fall off of it.
The
Right.
ego trap, so to speak.
Yeah. So I would say at best, those stories sound good, but they're actually very weak in the sense that they're not what helps us change habits or sustain good habits. What I mean by that is, at the end of the day, our thinking brain is not nearly as strong as our feeling body. So your body demonstrated that. You can say, I'm not that type of person, and your body says, oh yeah, watch.
It did show me.
Yeah.
So Jamie was talking about we're solution based. So
Mhm.
whenever somebody gets cued, triggered, craving, whatever, it's like the freight train leaves the station. It
Mhm.
is, I mean, a powerful, powerful force. Since we are so solution based, you have talked about some systems that are most efficacious in helping yourself when this situation comes on, when a cue, trigger, craving comes on. Do you want to talk about what you recommend?
And why are
Sure.
triggers, as you say, Dr. Brewer, why are triggers not the story here? I
Yeah.
love when you say that.
Yeah. So let's start with that, why are triggers not the solution? Because I see my patients get stuck in this all the time where they're trying to control their situation. They say, if I could just identify all the triggers, then I can either avoid them or I can control them or something, you know. And if you look at it from the neuroscience standpoint, the neuroscientists say, who cares about triggers? And what I mean by that is triggers only set the wheel in motion. They don't drive the process, and they don't change the process. So what does change the process is how rewarding a behavior is. That's why reinforcement learning is also known as reward-based learning, because we learn to do things if they're rewarding. And the corollary is that we also learn to stop doing them when they're not rewarding.
Mm-hmm.
So this is where, I started this clinically just as a pilot test, and then started doing clinical studies in my lab. We developed an app called Eat Right Now to study this, where we said, okay, let's take a neuroscience approach and leverage the strength of the brain to help people change their behaviors rather than willpower, because neuroscience doesn't even give a nod to willpower.
Mm-hmm.
I'll repeat that in case you may miss that.
No, that's huge.
That was not a misspeak on my part.
Yeah.
They don't, it will be in the equations of behavior change, but what is awareness. So we said, okay, let's leverage awareness. And the way that works is, well, I'll use a simple example. Let's say that I'm a big fan of chocolate. So let's say a new chocolatier opens up in my neighborhood, and I go in, and I've had see these amazing mango habanero truffles, right? Perfect mix of like sweet and spicy and sweet heat. And so I've got a gold standard for how good these things are based on, a certain place where I've gotten them. And so if I go in and they've got mango habanero truffles, I'm like, great. I try one, and I'm like, oh, mind blowing. This is so much better than even my gold standard. I get what's called a positive prediction error, meaning that's better than expected, better than my
Mm-hmm.
gold standard. I get a dopamine firing in my brain, and I learn, hey, this is a good place. They know how to make these truffles. On the other hand, if I eat it, I'm like, this tastes kind of like cardboard. I get what's called a negative prediction error. I also get dopamine firing, and I also learn, hey, they haven't gotten their stuff together.
You got a bad batch.
Yeah. So I'm not coming back here. Notice how both of those required awareness.
Mm-hmm.
So we can leverage that with the types of food that we eat. We can leverage that with the amount of food that we eat. And my lab actually did a study where we said, okay, let's bring people in, let's have them use our Eat Right Now app, and have them pay attention as they overeat or as they eat, food that they're struggling with. And it only took 10 to 15 times of somebody paying attention as they overeat for that reward value to drop below zero in their brain, and for them to start to shift that behavior. So notice how that had nothing to do with willpower, and it had everything to do with awareness. They paid attention. I've never had a patient that's come back to me when I've told them to pay attention and tell me what it's like when they overeat. They've never come back and said, "Thank you, Dr. Brewer. Oh, overeating feels so good. I love it. I'm going to do it more." Right? They start to see how painful it is because their body is saying, "Why are you doing this? This is painful." And so we've got everything that we need, but all of that comes from our feeling body. It has nothing to do with our thinking brain, because we try to think ourselves out of everything and it just doesn't work.
So this whole idea that you're talking about, the feeling body being more powerful than the thinking brain. So much of addiction science talks about the frontal lobe and the amygdala, the frontal lobe and the amygdala, and the battle for the blood flow, right? Between the two. And what you're saying is bypass that and put all of our effort into the feeling body. But what happens in the blood flow in the brain? Does it go to the frontal lobe when you're in the feeling body?
Well, first off, that's a little oversimplified in
Okay.
terms of how the brain works.
Okay.
And second, this is also I acknowledge it's a simplification, but it's backed by a fair amount of research. The prefrontal cortex is the youngest and the weakest part of the brain from an evolutionary perspective. It's the first that goes offline.
Mm-hmm.
So regardless of where the blood is flowing, and it's not, the blood is generally getting to the parts of the brain that it needs to get to.
Got it.
The prefrontal cortex goes offline when we're hungry, for example, when we're stressed, when we're anxious, when we're tired, all these things, all these times that we, relapse, for example, quote unquote, whether it's, the potato chip addiction or the cocaine or the heroin or the meth. So that's where we can leverage the parts of the brain that we fall back on when our prefrontal cortex is offline. That's the habit part. You know, they're not really parts, they're networks. But it's those habit networks that are the strongest part of the brain. So why not go there? And it really just takes a little bit of learning, right? I'm not saying everybody has to know, be a neuroscientist and know all of their neuroanatomy. All I'm saying is that we just do a little bit of tweaking and help people train themselves to go back to what you said at the beginning, right? Let's stop living that short distance from our body, become reconnected with ourselves, and then listen to the wisdom of our bodies.
I want to read a line in your book that was so good. You were talking about willpower, so I just wanted to bring that out. Studies have shown that only a lucky few are genetically endowed with willpower. Other studies have specifically shown that willpower is indeed more of a myth than a usable mental muscle. I thought that was very, very good. And tapping in onto that, that goes into, I want to talk a little bit about diets. You're very specific about your opinion on diets. There's not a diet you can name that I probably haven't been on. I mean, I spent, LA Weight Loss, Weight Watchers, whatever it was. And every time I've got my calculator, pen and paper out, and I'm writing down whether it's points or my bank account they want me to talk about. But I mean, I am like, oh, I gotta, make sure I've got to weigh and measure and do all that. I mean, it put me into a depression. And guess what? I didn't really lose weight. It's like my body didn't understand math, and I was supposed to be losing 2.5 pounds a week. Doesn't my body know? Because the math is right here. I did all my numbers and everything. So why is the scale not showing anything for days? And anyway, yeah, it's a psychological torture. But in one of your chapters in here, you talk about how weighing and measuring and calorie counting doesn't work. I would think every woman in America would be on their knees fanning your feet going, what? We never have to diet again? We don't have to weigh and we don't have to count our calories? That can't be right. That doesn't sound right. So you want to talk about that? Because that
Yeah.
is, I mean, major game changer.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would say is that freaks the crap out of a lot of people.
Totally. That's our safety net. How will we
I know.
know where we are?
It's freedom. It's freedom for me. Freedom.
Yeah.
Totally.
And so I'm saying this, not saying this lightly. I've had a number of patients who have struggled in abusive relationships and then wonder why they keep going back to abusive relationships until they realize that it's their comfort zone because it's what's familiar to them.
The devil they know.
Yeah. And familiar does not equal safe, especially in abusive relationships. It's anti-safe.
I like that.
And familiar does not equal healthy.
Right.
So familiar, if somebody is familiar with food rules, just as a general, because there's going to be some rule with a diet. That's what diets are by definition about. Just follow these rules. You make sure you pay your fee.
Yeah.
And then you can, whether it's buying the book or your subscription or whatever. And then, theoretically you're good to go. So what that does is not only perpetuate, this idea that we are not good enough when we can't follow the diet, but also that there's something wrong with us, So here it's really important to step back and start asking these questions around, well, what is going on here? And so what we we is like, okay, why do I talk about, calorie counting and things like this not being helpful? So one, they're notoriously inaccurate. Two, I shouldn't say they help because they don't really help. They focus people externally rather than internally, right? This goes back to the Mr. Duffy living a short distance from his body because he's spending all his time on his calorie counting app.
Yeah.
Right.
I know him. He lives next door.
Yeah. So we learn to not listen to our bodies. We learn that there's something wrong with us if we can't follow the formula. And we learn that, oh, well, there must be something wrong because, the formula says I should be losing 2 pounds a week and I'm not doing it. In contrast, when we listen to our bodies are going to tell us everything that we need to know because our bodies are designed for us because they are us. So they are personalized as compared to an app, which is generic and terrible at being accurate. our bodies tell us everything that we need to know.
But is that true if you're in processed food? If you're in processed food, do you know the difference between hunger and cravings? I think those messages get tangled up if your diet is in the processed food. I don't know that my body does know what to tell me to do with the 2 potato chips. What the messages I was getting were completely different than what a calm, rational person would be thinking.
Who's
Yeah.
eating?
So yeah, it's a really good point. It can take some time to recalibrate.
Yes, that's what I wanted to talk about.
Yeah. And so, for example, I write in the book about a group of, it happened to be women at the time that all had diagnoses of binge eating disorder. And it actually took me about a month, felt like I was a stranger in a strange land where, I was like, what am I missing here? And what I was missing was I had this assumption that they could actually tell when they were hungry,
Yes,
and they couldn't.
No.
One woman summed it up: I have an urge and I eat.
that's right. What
Yeah.
sounds good.
Yeah. So it takes a while for a lot of people to recalibrate and this is about reconnecting with our bodies, relearning what those hunger signals are and trusting them.
Yeah.
And so I actually have some exercises in the book for people to use to recalibrate that system. It can take some time, but everybody, this is such a fundamental and important process that we have. Everybody has that. And it's a matter of, being individual for, time, and also being open to really paying attention, because it can be so scary for a lot of people that they distance themselves, and it makes it take longer for them to be able to do that recalibration process. The recalibration has everything to do with awareness. Everything has everything to do with awareness in terms of leveraging our brains.
It's a self-trust thing. If I could trust myself, I wouldn't be in this mess, is probably the message they're getting. So of anything to trust, myself would be the last thing that I would choose, right?
Yes.
I would depend on I would believe anything else other than me.
Your thinking brain says that.
Yeah.
And then when you start just throwing caution to the wind and saying, well, what happens? Like, I'm already out of control anyway, whatever that means. So let me just go out and pay attention. Well, like, go off the rails and pay attention as I go off the rails. So what I tell people is, hey, you've probably, done something crazy anyway. So just go crazy, but pay attention as you do it. Right. And that helps to disarm that fear of, oh no, I'm going to go off the rails. Because guess what? They're already going to go off the rails anyway. So go off the rails, but pay attention. And if they've done it a bunch of times, we have this gold mine in us that we can be mining, where it's like, oh, I already have this wisdom. What was it like the last time I went off the rails? What did that feel like? So we can start developing that disenchantment with that thing that we fear. And so, we can fear it, or we can ask ourselves, how good is this anyway?
Yeah. Yeah. So that connects to this whole idea of kindness and compassion, which you bring in as part of a huge part of the solution. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. So, part of the diet culture is that, we just have to follow the formula, and it's, we're not strong enough to do it. And so we feel like there's something wrong with this, which implies, and it sometimes is more overt, where we're judging ourselves. There's something wrong with me. What's wrong with me? That person can do it. I can't do it. And so self-judgment gets set up as a habit loop. It's like, oh, if I beat myself up, that's going to help me get in more control. Guess what? It doesn't work. It does the opposite. And so I see, for so many people, they judge themselves, they feel bad, and then they eat because they're in that negative reinforcement loop. So one, it doesn't help us open to learning, because when we're judging, we're closed down. We're in a fixed mindset, as compared to being in a, Carol Dweck's terms, growth mindset. We've got to be open to learning. That's what growth mindset's all about. When we're judging ourselves, we're literally, when somebody is yelling at us, we're closing down. When we're yelling at ourselves, we're closing down. So we've got to learn to step out of those habit loops. And we can do that the same way by seeing, oh, does self-judgment actually help? Has it helped so far? No.
Touche.
Yeah.
You know, that leads right into you have a rain technique that you talk about in your book that I think is really excellent, especially when you apply this to cravings. Like, you know, when the train leaves the station, maybe this is a good time to apply those rain techniques. You want to talk about that?
Sure. And this is after somebody has started to recalibrate and reconnect with their body, where they can tell, am I reaching for food because I'm hungry versus an emotion, for example. So if somebody it can tell the difference between the homeostatic and the hedonic hunger, and they say, oh, I'm reaching because I'm anxious, I'm reaching for the potato chips, or I'm automatically, just because it's that joke about the seafood diet, I see the potato chips and I eat them. Right. So as we reach for it, or as we notice this urge to eat, the R stands for recognize. So we got to recognize, we got to wake up from that spell, from that alien possession. That's what the R stands for. The A is to acknowledge or accept that this is happening, right? So if we resist our experience, what we resist persists, it just gets stronger. So we're like, okay, here it is. Here's this craving. And that helps us open, right? As compared to close down and resist. Oh, here's this craving. And the I stands for investigate. And that's what that oh is all about, where we get curious. Oh. And
Hmm.
instead of going, oh no, here's this craving, where we close down and resist it, we go, oh, here's this craving. Here it comes. Huh. What does a craving feel like? And the N stands for note. We can start to note specifically what the craving feels like in our body. As we do that, that brings in what's called the observer effect, which in a nutshell is when you observe something, you change your relationship to it, you change the result. And so if we start observing a craving by feeling it in our body and feeling the characteristics and how it's changing, we are not as identified with it. It goes back to that story, right? So the story could be, oh, I have these strong cravings, I have to fight them, right? That's a story we tell ourselves.
Yeah,
So
right.
we can get past the story and to ask the simple question, oh, what does this feel like? How long is it going to last? Am I afraid of this? All of these
Mhm.
things. And we
Mhm.
can even note what the stories are. Oh, here's this fear story.
Yes.
Somebody on our online community just posted yesterday or today saying, I have all this fear. How do I work with the fear? Right. Well, we note, oh, here's fear. And instead of going, oh no, which is what fear is all about, we can go, oh, this is what scary feels like. Right.
What
And
is it?
sometimes if there's a lot of, yeah, exactly. And if there's a lot of fear, I have people ask this simple question. I have them look around, like look around the room and ask, am I actually in danger right now?
Hmm.
Because we can have learned fear versus actual fear. Right.
Yeah.
So if somebody's coming up behind me and they're going to claw, let's not use a violent analogy, but there are a lot of reasons for us to be afraid, right? In real life. Like if I'm stepping out, if I'm walking down the street and stuck on my phone, checking my social media, and not looking both ways, and this car comes and screeches on its brakes, that's good fear, right? That's going to help
Right.
me relearn what my parents told me, which was look both ways before crossing the street. And which my phone, my smartphone got me to become really dumb really quickly, and forget that. So there's real fear. I need to step back. That helps me learn, hey, put your phone away. The learned fear, which is like, oh no, I might not have enough food or whatever,
Right.
like that was something I'd learned in residency when, I'd have overnight shifts and whatnot. And it's like, oh, I could be starving. And then what am I going to do? Well, I can unlearn those if it's a learned fear response where I actually do have access to food and I'm not going to starve to death tonight. Do you see the difference?
Totally.
Hmm.
Totally. And I'll share something on that too, because in doing the prep work for this episode, I was spending a lot more time just noticing my thoughts around certain food behaviors. And in the last week, I noticed that I had this deep, obviously false belief, but also fear that the food will be taken away, or there won't be enough, or I won't be able to have access to it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's deep. I think it relates back to when I was an infant. Just for some of the stories that I was told, the way I behaved around food as an infant, and
Mm-hmm.
even a toddler. And so I wonder, how does this process work for someone who's got, for those of us who have these deep beliefs that are decades long?
Yeah. The good news is, so, it only took in our studies, it only took 10 to 15 times of somebody paying attention as they overeat for that
Mm,
reward value shift below zero. What
wow.
that highlights is how tremendously neuroplastic our brain is, right? Our brain has to learn to adapt to an ever-changing environment. So no matter how deep or old a story or a habit is, it can actually change relatively quickly. Our brains have to do that because we have to be able to adapt.
Right.
So the more we can, so we can acknowledge these stories and we can then ask ourselves, is this true now?
Mm.
And that helps break the spell of the story where we can say, oh, that's a story. We can acknowledge it. We don't ignore it. We don't push it away. We just name it, right? That's
Yeah.
the noting
Yeah.
part. Oh, there's that story.
Yeah. And I was able to do that very gratefully. And I remember thinking, okay, so now that I'm able to see it and I'm able to say, I notice I'm having the thought that this food is not going to be available to me, or this food's going to be taken away from me, or I'm not going to have the food that I need.
Yeah.
I was able to start to see, okay, now let me see what this feels like in my body.
Yeah.
And it felt like clenching
Uh-huh.
all over, but particularly in this area, right?
Yeah.
I was tight and clenching. Um, and I still wonder if a lot of times I ate all those years sort of as a way to sort of assuage this clenching that I had in my
Mhm.
chest,
Yeah.
sort of to almost comfort and soothe, physically soothe, right, with the food going down the esophagus.
Yeah. And so that clenching, that could be an example of negative reinforcement, right? So there's the clenching, it's unpleasant, you eat, you feel better, and it reinforces itself.
Yeah.
So if that's a learned behavior, it can be unlearned, right? And then for example, with the rain practice, oh, here's clenching. And we can just learn to sit with the clenching. We don't have to eat food. That's what helps us unlearn that old habit.
Yes. Yes. Beautiful. Beautiful.
Amazing. You give a lot of wonderful advice in this book. For example, one of your pieces of advice was slow down when you're eating. It's going to take 20 minutes for those signals to reach the brain that you're full. In fact, I even wonder if that alone would solve a lot of our problems if people would just slow down, and how much that would reduce problems. But uh, of all the advice you give, all wonderful. Is there any non-negotiables that you must have this in place, or like your greatest piece of advice that if you were on your deathbed, you would want to leave us with one piece of advice that would help the most amount of people in the greatest amount of way?
Yeah, I would say curiosity and kindness are your best friends. Don't leave home without them.
Yeah.
Oh,
Don't
that's
leave home. I
beautiful.
love that. If home is our body. Beautiful.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Well, thank you. Jamie, you want to say something?
Yeah, no, just echo what you just said. Thank you. This has been a really, really helpful conversation. As far along as we are in recovery, I'm almost 16 years, and Paige has several years under her belt. To hear these principles framed in a way right from the man who's sort of pioneering these principles in a way that's really helping people um, across the board for now a number of years yourself, it is inspiring. And I also deeply appreciate the fact that you're so honest to say, hey, I wasn't wired to struggle with food. I don't inherently understand that, the ways that folks use food versus the ways that I did, that I had food growing up. But you still came to us, to people like us, to the communities that are filled with folks that use food the way we did and do. And you were so kind and compassionate and curious and loving. And I really believe that is why, one of the many reasons that you're starting to see that the change that you're making, because you've come to this group not in a judgmental way, but in a loving and curious way. So thank you.
Yeah,
Well,
that's
yeah, thank you. I've learned everything from my patients, and so it's constantly humbling and constantly life-giving to just, I think of myself as a kind of a co-learner and a co-journeyer. And that's certainly not only keeps things interesting, but hopefully helps us all move forward because I'm learning. And as a scientist, maybe I can, bring some of these principles to light that anybody can use to help them in their journey.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Yeah, you did not have to go this path, but we appreciate your efforts so much. So many are gleaning, I mean, just getting their life back by your work. So we really appreciate it. 1 million thank yous. We appreciate you being here. And when you write your next book, I hope you'll come back and be with us again. Have you got a new one in the works yet?
No, not right now. This is plenty.
No, yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you again, Dr.
Yeah.
Brewer. And we invite you to check us out at realfoodrecovery4u.com. That's the number 4 and the letter U, realfoodrecovery4u.com, where you can find more information on our podcast and on our recovery community. And again, a big thank you to Dr. Brewer, and a big thank you to you, Paige. Always a joy to partner with you.
Bye, guys. See you next time.
Take care.